Hello and welcome, everyone, to our First Citizens You First series titled Improved Decision Making and Stress Management. I am your host, Chuck Walkendorfer, President of Distribution at Think2Perform. This is the fifth session. Our topic today is behavioral financial advice. We're going to dig deeper into the psychological phenomena and neuroscience that affect our decision making. As many of you may have remembered, listening to our earlier series, Think2Perform is a business and sports performance firm. We work with executives, athletes, and business owners to improve decision making under pressure. So we work with everybody from the FBI to American Express, doctors, nurses in surgery, pro and college athletes. And what you can remember about performance is a function of three things. I don't care what you do, where you live, the color of your skin, male or female. Performance in any area of life is a function of, number one, talent. So talent being things that we're always good at and can never remember learning. So things like math or music or sports, things we had a natural affinity for. Part number two are skills. So skills are things I develop over my lifetime. So I may have had a talent for music and I developed the skill to play the piano. And the third part of performance is decision making. So it's talent plus skill plus decision making equals performance. And of the three, decision making has twice the impact on performance than talent and skill combined. I'm not suggesting that talent and skill don't matter. They just don't matter as much as decision making. And unlike our IQ, which we can't improve, we can, with practice and focus and effort, become better decision makers. And we make about 35,000 decisions a day. Does that surprise anybody? Most of them we don't think about. So brushing our teeth, getting dressed in the morning, when we used to drive to the office, driving to work, we tend to live our lives out of a part of our brain called the basal ganglia. That's the habit center part of our brain. And that frees up our prefrontal cortex, the logical thinking part of our brain, to work on the bigger issues of the day. Like, what time do I have to pick up my kids? And am I ready for my meeting today? Those kinds of things. And we don't have to make all 35,000 decisions better each day, but we've got to make probably less than a handful. And we make 2, 3, 4 better decisions a day. Over the course of a year, we're talking about 700 to 1,000 better decisions over 12 months. And what we're talking about here specifically today with behavioral financial advice is decision making under pressure with your money. Now today, we are fortunate to have one of my esteemed Think2Perform colleagues, Ray Kelly. Ray is a senior vice president with Think2Perform. He's been with us for just exactly 10 years. So congratulations on your 10-year anniversary, Ray. Ray has a storied 21-year career prior to joining Think2Perform as a financial services senior executive. He looks far too young. I know you can't see him on screen to have a career like that. He spent the majority of his career on the sales side of the business, compiling a stellar track record of developing high-performing leaders and teams. Ray began his career after receiving his BBA from the University of Michigan. His first position was as financial analyst with IDS in Minneapolis. While working at IDS, he was a recipient of the highest award for employees, the Premier Performer Award. After moving to Dallas, Ray spent 13 years growing and building one of the most successful sales office groups for American Express in the history of the company. Ray's offices were recognized annually for top sales growth, retention, client satisfaction, and employee satisfaction. His focus on creating a leaderful culture allowed his group to influence the larger national organization on nearly all major initiatives and created the opportunity for over a dozen of his leaders to be promoted to other positions across the company. Ray has a passion for helping people reach their potential and shaping cultures in which they live. He offers executive coaching, mentoring the leaders of all levels, and conducts proven breakthrough leadership development training. He's a sought-after national public speaker with exceptional ability to move people from complacency to laughter, to tears to action. Ray and his beautiful wife, Amy, reside in Minnesota with their 4 mostly wonderful children. Would that be correct, Ray?
Mostly wonderful. They've been really good recently. It's good to have, and thanks for having me, Chuck, and appreciate the congratulations on the 10 years. I didn't realize it until you said that. So yeah, it's 10 years this month. So
You've been just a terrific addition to our Think2Perform team. And I know you were with us a few weeks ago talking about the leadership logic chain. I think that might have been session number 3. And today we're talking about behavioral financial advice. So is there a connection between the leadership logic chain and what we're talking about here today with behavioral financial advice? What's the connection there?
Yeah, there definitely is a connection. When you think about the leadership logic chain, and I won't go through all of it again, but at the foundation of the leadership logic chain is self-awareness, and specifically self-awareness on your decision making. And what we're going to talk about today is the hidden traps in decision making. Some of these things that, unless you're self-aware of, can be impacting those decisions. Chuck, I was taking notes as you were doing your intro, and until you said it recently to me, 35,000 decisions a day. And it's impossible to be conscious, nor do you want to be conscious on the vast majority of those decisions. But the few decisions that impact your life on a daily basis, it would be real important to understand some of these impacts, some of these things we're going to talk about today that can potentially negatively impact the path of your leadership, the effectiveness you have in your relationships with others, and also the relationship you have with your money. And that's what we're going to talk about today is those items.
Terrific. So jump us into this topic on behavioral finance and like, what are we talking about when it comes to psychology?
Perfect. Yeah, what I want to talk about today is there's a couple of things that we're going to talk about. One is the psychological impact of your decision making. And we're going to talk about biases. We're going to talk about the framing effect and heuristics, kind of rules of thumb that we use. And then we're going to talk about the neuroscience of the brain and how that can also impact your decision making. And I actually think that is, when I first learned about the neuroscience, it really was a wow for me. It was like I had no idea how much the brain impacts this decision making that I had no control over. I didn't think I had control over, but I need to be aware of.
Yeah.
So let's start with the psychological elements that affect our decision making. We're going to start with biases. Most of us know what a bias is. A bias is something that, again, you have a predisposed way of thinking about something, okay, that may prejudice you in favor of a certain thing or person, a group, or just some thought that you have. And here are some of those predisposition toward error that we may have. Let's just talk about the first one, excessive optimism. I don't like this one. This is kind of seeing this bias seen through rose-colored glasses. And one of the things I quickly think back to is, Chuck, and you and I were talking about being in the business way back when, in the financial services industry back in the 90s. And back in the 90s, things were roaring and going and stuff like that. And most years we were getting double-digit returns on our portfolio. And all of a sudden, people started to expect. I remember seeing a study come back from one of the investment news or whatever it was. It was expected rate of return from our clients was 12% per year. And I remember, God, that's crazy to expect that. And it was only because we've been getting it. And they were getting 18% that year. So all of a sudden that became the norm. But this excessive optimism can impact your decision making. And you need to understand that it doesn't always work this way. But you start making decisions on that.
Yeah, it's like the new normal. Like you start expecting it, and so you start to base your decisions based on that assumption. Well, if it's been 12% for the last 3 or 4 years, it must be 12% for the next 3 or 4 years. And what you're saying is that may not be true.
Absolutely. And I know you and I have talked about this before. Both of us lived through buying our first home in the 80s, okay, and buying and selling houses. And back then in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, it was almost automatic. You bought a house and you made money on it when you sold it.
Yeah.
Then 08, 09 occurred, and all of a sudden that way of thinking changed. But we had this
anymore. Yeah, right.
Not automatic anymore, which kind of leads to that overconfidence bias. I think about this. This is not the same as being confident, but overconfidence is having too much confidence. Okay, And what happens is when you have too much confidence is you sometimes stop paying attention to the details that led to that confidence. Because confidence comes from having some success. And again, I think back to in my career where I had some overconfidence for a period of time. We were doing really, really well and doing the seminar program. We brought in new clients. We had it down pat. It was a seamless thing. But because of our overconfidence, we started taking for granted certain elements of the process. And all of a sudden our results started to fall. And a lot of it had to do is we stopped paying attention to the details because of overconfidence. I think of this sometimes happens in relationships, Chuck. All of a sudden you and I have been working together for so many years, Chuck. I take you for granted, you take me for granted. I'm going to be prepared, you're going to be prepared. He has my back, all of those different things. And the next thing you know, you're taking the person for granted. You're not doing the little things you used to with me.
It was kind of sloppy almost, like putting on automatic pilot.
Absolutely. And understanding we have these biases and they affect the decisions we make, thus our actions and performance, and thus the relationships we have with other people. My favorite on this list right here is the confirmation bias. I love this.
Why is that?
We all live it. This is the bias we have where we often will look to ignore information that would go against how we think. Because I think it's part of human nature is we like to be right.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Chuck. Do you like to be right?
People have told me that on occasion.
I think we all like to be right. And so what we do is we look for information that confirms our rightness. And we will ignore the information that may actually be counter to our way of thinking. Here's a great example. This is why I love it, because everyone can see themselves in the situation. Most of us will watch the TV station, okay, the news station that confirms our side of the political world.
Yeah.
And we watch it religiously because it continues to confirm us. And occasionally we'll turn it over to the other side of the TV channels to see what the idiots are thinking.
Right.
Okay. And it's that confirmation bias. This is why it's so important. I know I spent a lot of time, Chuck, with, again, my 4 kids. They're not kids anymore. They're young adults, 18 to 24. We've spent a lot of time actually helping them understand that they have a bias, okay, one way or another. And the other side isn't completely idiotic and stupid. They're not. And be able to understand and try to empathize and view it from their lens. And it's hard to do because of this bias we have.
Well, I'm guessing too, Ray, I just want to maybe continue that line of thinking. If I'm aware of my confirmation bias, and if I can open my mind to hearing another point of view, what you're saying, I don't want to correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is that could help us improve our decision making. Like we might learn something we don't already know.
Yeah, I like that. It's back to, we don't have that many decisions that we're conscious about. You talked about so many, just waking up in the morning.
Yeah.
Okay. We may be conscious about what we wear. Do I shave? Do I shower? All of those things, but there's just hundreds and hundreds of decisions that we're making. But I think it's real important to be conscious of these real important decisions and how these biases can impact it one way or another. And eventually they can take you the wrong direction. And we're going to talk about some of these things here in a second. Because let's go to the next section, heuristics. Heuristics are rules of thumb. They're mental shortcuts. All of us use them whether we're aware of it or not, okay? When I'm talking in front of a group of people, I know this is a form of a podcast, but when I'm in front of a group of people, I ask people for some examples. So I'll ask you, Chuck, what's a rule of thumb or heuristic that you use on a daily basis?
Oh, when I used to drive to the office, how long it was going to take me to get to work? You know, and
it works for you.
Anybody else suffered from this, but I always used the best time, the fastest time I ever got, driving in the middle of the night to the office, the best time I ever clocked getting from my house to the office as my rule of thumb. And what I would find is, I think to your point, is weather, traffic, accidents, time of day, all of that would have an impact on whether or not my rule of thumb was accurate.
and here's a good rule of thumb about heuristics. During periods of stability, when things are consistent, they serve us well. In times of instability, heuristics sometimes can hurt us. So back to all of a sudden, yeah, you have traffic or a snowstorm. We're both from snowy places. It doesn't work. It's going to take me 15 minutes to get to work. That rule of thumb.
Right.
So when I ask groups this question, some of them they use, here's a couple examples. Measure twice, cut once. Buy low, sell high. Heuristics works really good.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Always own a home versus rent. Okay. Great idea. It's a rule of thumb, a mental shortcut that a lot of people live by. And I was talking to a client recently. He was frustrated with his father, retired father, 76 years old. And he says, Ray, I think he still treats me like I'm 18 years old. I go, why so? He goes, well, we'd work on these projects at the cottage, and he doesn't think I can do the work. He's always on me. He said, the measure twice, cut once. He said, I get that. I believe in that. But my dad's measure 12 times, cut once.
Wow.
He goes, a 20-minute project turns into a 2-hour project, but that's his rule of thumb. And I said, tell me about your father. And he says to me, he said, my father he's retired and comes from the Iron Range in Minnesota. He worked in the mines. And his last decade or so, he was responsible for explosives.
Oh my God! I thought you were going to say, I was expecting like he worked on atomic bombs, but that's just is almost as bad. Like working with explosives, I can imagine how that shaped.
Yeah, shaped his thinking. It's a rule of thumb that worked for him. He didn't measure twice. He measured over and over again. There were so many precautions and systems. And I just said to Derek, you're not going to change that. Okay? You're not going to change how he views that. So heuristics work for us in times of stability, and in many times we don't even know we use these things, and it impacts us in so many different places. But sometimes they go out of favor, and I'm going to give you an example of one that impacts all of the people on the phone at some point in time in your life. Just the term retirement. Okay? The rule of thumb about retirement. Chuck, what's the rule of thumb of the age in which we retire in America?
Oh, I think we've all been inculcated to understand that 65 is the age of retirement, right?
Yeah.
From the earliest days. I mean, hearing my grandparents talk about it, my parents talk about it, it was always like 65 was this magical age.
Magical age. Do you have any idea where that came from? 65.
I guess maybe like Social Security, but I don't know that for sure.
That's where most people guess, but it even goes back further. It goes back to 1878, and it actually comes from Germany. So the retirement age that's used across the globe started in 1878 in Germany in a labor strike between the labor unions and the government in Germany, okay? And to appease the labor unions, what they did was they put a pension plan in that started at age 65.
Wow.
At the period of time in 1878 in Germany, the average age expectancy was 47 years old.
You're kidding me. Wow.
So they picked a number out of the sky.
Yeah.
That was 18
like nobody's gonna get to 65 if they're living to 47. Yeah.
Yet it's the heuristic that we use across the globe about retirement age.
Yeah.
Okay. Back to Social Security. In the United States, it came into play in the 1930s. The average life expectancy then was 61 in America. 61.
Wow.
And they picked 65. My whole point of this heuristic is outdated.
Yeah.
Let me give some factoids for people. And again, we're living longer. The average life expectancy of people in America today is 83, 84. But Chuck, how old's your youngest daughter?
15.
15. For the people on the phone, if you have children or grandchildren, 10 and younger, their average life expectancy now is 120. Retirement age is midlife.
Wow, 120. Let me let that sink in, man.
Yeah, we're living longer. So it's back to understand sometimes we make decisions based on rules of thumb that work for us during certain periods of time, but sometimes they get outdated, or during instability, it goes away.
I remember even in my own life, like, I'm older than you are, Ray, but I remember when you met somebody when I was a kid, you met somebody who was 80, they were old. And My mom turned 80 a few years ago, and we had a big birthday party for her, and I'd say 2/3 of the people at the party were over 80, and they drove themselves there. So your point is well made. Like retiring at 65 isn't what it used to be.
Which leads me to the next kind of psychological phenomenon that affects your decision making. That's framing. It's what you're seeing most recently often affects the way you think about it now. That's a form of framing. I'm going to do an exercise with you, Chuck, and play along with me at home if you would, which is a framing exercise. I want to show people how easy it is to quote unquote frame or be framed. Okay, Chuck, what color is this piece of paper?
White.
Okay, what do cows drink?
Milk. No, they actually don't drink milk, do they? You got me.
Yeah, they drink water. For the people who may be from the city, cows drink water, they give milk. But here's the thing about cows. Just the thought of cows brings two thoughts into most people's mind: moo and milk.
Yep.
And because I got you to think the word white by pointing at this white piece of paper, you said white, and thus when I said cow, you said milk.
Sure.
I framed you. That's how easy something most recently frames it.
Yeah.
All right. So it's back to what's happening in the market right now. We'll frame how you think about the market recently. I'm going to do another one with you. I'm going to frame you on framing. We just talked about framing. Play along at home too, if you would, because I'm going to ask Chuck a series of questions again. Chuck, how many letters in the alphabet?
26.
Okay, spell roast for me. Roast.
Roast. ROAST.
Okay, what do you put in a toaster?
Now, because I'm on guard, I would almost said toast, but it's bread. Toaster
You got it.
comes out of a toaster. Yeah, but I was a little bit more vigilant this time.
Because we've been talking about framing most recently, you were on guard. And this is exactly how most people do it when I do this exercise with groups of people. And they go, how many letters in the alphabet? And you could just see them go, I don't want to be tricked on this. It's 26.
Yeah, they're paying attention.
They're paying attention. Then I say roast because the last time I got you on the second question.
Mm-hmm.
So people spell it really slow. R-O-A-S-T. And when then I go to the third question, I go, sometimes they give up their guard. A third of the people still say you put toast in a toaster. Even when I'm framing them, I'm framing.
Yeah.
Okay. But 2/3 of the people now start getting it right. All right. So it's back to that's framing, folks. And one of the most common forms of framing is around loss conversion. I know you were telling me a story about one of your clients, Chuck, about having an 8-figure client and how she framed him about risk aversion versus loss aversion. I love you to just share that.
It was a financial advisor who actually was going through a similar workshop like we're doing here today. I think she was talking about one of her clients who had an 8-figure portfolio, and she was asking about how much risk he was willing to take with his portfolio, and he confidently said, I'm willing to accept a plus or minus 10% fluctuation in my portfolio. And to her credit, the financial advisor said, so that means that you're willing to accept a $1 million loss in your portfolio. And the client said, no, that's not what I mean. But she said, well, that's what I'm asking you. Right? And I think that's the difference between risk aversion, like I'm willing to take risk as long as it works out. But loss aversion is like, what am I willing to lose? That's a different question.
And by her saying losing $1 million, that's kind of like saying white. Okay, it's real.
Yeah.
She framed it. That's the framing effect, folks. All of a sudden, hey, your portfolio can go up 10, plus 10, minus 10. Yeah, I can do that. And then you're all of a sudden, are you willing to lose $1 million? No. Same exact thing, losing 10% and losing $1 million, framing. All right, it has an impact. One of the things we've learned is losing $1 is 7 times more emotional than gaining $1.
Wow.
And we're going to talk about how the brain works and how that emotions can impact you in just a second. But before we leave this section, Chuck, I want to say, what's the so what here? You have these biases. You use these heuristics. Framing affects you and others. So part of this is becoming self-aware of this stuff, preparing yourself for these things. okay? And I think it's so important, and we're going to talk about future sessions about tools you can use to increase your self-awareness, but knowing that these things exist will help you make better decisions long-term.
And it's part of, I think, too, Ray, what the role of your wealth professional at First Citizens is to help you as a client, as an investor, prepare for. He or she is there to help you mitigate some of these psychological dispositions that you have towards making mistakes with your money. Because I know, and we've talked at Think2Perform about how 87% of portfolio growth is saving and investing behavior. And I'm not talking about portfolio performance. Portfolio growth, 87% of it is driven by how long someone stays invested and how much they invest. And that's more than asset allocation, investment selection, and market timing combined. And saving and investing behavior, what we decide to do with our money, is in our control. And so the role of a First Citizens Wealth professional is to help you mitigate some of these mistakes that Ray's been talking about. So tell us about the brain, Ray.
Well, this was my big aha, folks, over the last decade or so, when I learned more and more about this, working with Think2Perform, how the brain works. Because the first thing that's always activated, you have a stimulus. Every human is wired the same way in terms of the first thing that is always activated is your emotions. And it starts in the emotional center of the brain called the amygdala. Okay, the amygdala is activated, it takes 12 milliseconds. Again, I don't know how they timed it, but they did. They watched stimulus and they watched that center of the brain be activated, and it takes 12 milliseconds. And it's based on the way that we were created, wired emotionally first, logically second. It was for safety purposes. Big part of the amygdala is the fight or flight process.
Pick up danger. Yeah.
Danger. They kept you alive, folks, because it takes 40 milliseconds before the prefrontal lobe, the rational center of your brain, is activated. Still pretty fast, but 3.5 times slower than the emotional center. And the thing about it is the emotional center can be activated to a level that it can actually override the logical center. We called it amygdala hijack.
Yeah.
Chuck, if you've heard the term, I was so mad I couldn't think straight.
Of course.
It actually happens, folks. Again, they've watched the amygdala get so activated, and it creates chemicals. One of them is called cortisol, and cortisol actually slows down that process of the prefrontal lobe. And I won't go into all of the detail because it would bore people, but I think it's important to understand we're wired emotionally first. And I want to tell everyone who's listening, here's the thing. It is impossible not to be emotional. Impossible. Now, what you do with your emotions, which we're going to talk about here in a second, is a choice. But it's impossible not to have the emotion you're having. All right? And so if someone says you quit being emotional, you don't go back. Impossible. You're feeling what you're feeling, folks. What you do with that feeling goes, either you can go right to action, or you can actually go to logical center. And it's important to realize you're going through this. Again, self-awareness of going through this.
So you're suggesting that stupid is optional, Ray? Is that what you're saying?
Stupid is optional. Yeah, emotional is not optional.
Yeah.
Stupid is optional.
I got it.
Now, we don't typically make our best decisions when we're highly emoted.
I got it.
If we go to the next slide, I love this slide. When I first saw this slide years ago, I was like, this is so good. These are the emotions, folks. So there's not good emotions or bad emotions. You just have emotions. You have high emotions, anger, fear, ecstatic, excited. You have low emotions, kind of sleepy, burnout, exhausted. You have positive emotions there on the right-hand side of your screen, and you have negative emotions. Now, Chuck, when you look at this slide, where do you think you make your best decisions, your most consistent decisions?
I'd say down there, like around challenged and confident, right there.
Yeah, and that's what we found, right in that sweet spot. Positive to mid-level emotions, folks. Positive mid-level. We do not make our best decisions even when we're ecstatic and excited. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Vegas. I have. Occasionally hit a number or something, and you're gung-ho and you're excited. Almost never do you leave the casino when you're very ecstatic and excited. You're like, one more, one more.
Yep.
You keep giving it back. You don't make
You
great
move it
decisions.
back. Yeah.
Yeah, you give it back. And I'm going to give an example of real life. My uncle was in the Navy. I'm named after him. My Uncle Ray was in the Navy. We spent 2 years on a submarine. And one of the things he shared with me was the vast majority of their time in the submarine was spent in what they called dry dock. Okay. They weren't actually out in the water necessarily, but when they're in dry dock, when they were painting the sub and doing the maintenance, that's when they were doing the vast majority of their drills. They're doing battle stations, they're doing emergency drills, they're doing them over and over and over again. And it was because the level of emotion and stress was very low. Once you get to the water and you have 1,000 feet of water stress on you, and all of a sudden you have an emergency, you can't make mistakes.
Right.
Okay. And they practice it during that period of time when they're confident. It made them confident. It made them calm. Versus all of a sudden you have high stress situation, whether you like it or not, fear starts to act upon you, anxiety acts upon you, and they want to have it just kind of, it's the norm. I call that preparing for the certainty of uncertainty. It's the same thing that First Citizens does with their clients. It's like, let's think about what we want to do when the market goes up 20% quarter, and what to do when the market goes down 20% in a quarter. Let's prepare in dry dock for that while our emotions are in the right spot.
Let's have a plan. Let's have a process in place so that we're not thinking about it when we get emotional. That's what you're saying.
Yes. Don't make the decision when the COVID crisis has occurred.
Yeah.
People do not make great decisions during that period of time. Okay. And the data is overwhelming, folks. Delbar does a study every single year and it looks at performance of investments versus what the investors get in those investments. Every single year, it says between 350 and 450 basis point difference between the investment is better than what the investor gets because of investor behavior.
They act on that emotion.
They act on that emotion, and that's a tough thing to do. So my big so what for people, no matter what you're in, whether it's investments, working with your children, a colleague, is prepare for the certainty of uncertainty. What are we going to do, Chuck, to your thing, when it snows?
Right.
Going to leave early for work.
Right.
Okay? It seems so simple, but not always easy, because of these ways that we are already mentally framed, how we have these biases and we have these neural connections in our head. It just, when you start to understand it, you can go, I can train myself. I can, by being more self-aware. But these things exist, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not.
And that's the role of your First Citizens Wealth professionals, to help you, as Ray is suggesting, have this practice in dry dock, have a game plan, know what your longer term goals and objectives are, understand how they connect to your values, which we'll talk about in a future session, so that when you get emotional, whether it's high energy negative or high energy positive, if you're aware of that and can reflect on the things that you said were important, that you planned for, when we reflect on what's important, we calm down. And when we're calmer, we're able to think more clearly and make better choices. Ray, any parting comments before we wrap today?
I think you hit it on the head right there, Chuck. I think for everyone, you're going to hear a few more following sessions on how to do those things. But you said it really well.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody for their time and attention here today. If you'd like to learn more, you can contact us at Think2Perform. Kyle DeBell is our contact there. His email address is kdebell@think2perform.com. Our next session, session number 6, will be on the alignment model, which will be about how do we align our decision-making and behavior with our goals and with our values. On behalf of Ray Kelly, my colleague at Think2Perform, I want to thank everybody for their time and attention. If you would like to learn more, you can also contact your First Citizens Wealth professional directly, or go to the website at firstcitizens.com. On behalf of Ray and myself, have a great rest of the week, and you'll be hearing from us soon. Thank you.